Okay, welcome. So happy to have you here today for Taking Wing, a Century of Flight in the Brunswick region with Jym St. Pierre, who's our presenter. And before I introduce Jim, I just want to cover a few items with you. I am Larissa Vigu-Picard. I'm director of Pejepscot History Center, and we're so pleased to bring you this program that was actually rescheduled from the summer and is a complement to the wonderful exhibition that Jim curated in the spring for us. It opened in the spring and is still open here at 159 Park Row in Brunswick at the History Center until December 17. That's a Friday. At 4 p.m. So please, if you have not seen the exhibition, plan to come in. It is free admission. We are open Wednesday through Friday, 10 to 4 at this point. We're on our winter hours, even though it still feels like a very mild fall out there. I want to, first of all, thank Jim profusely for all that he's done for Pejepscot History Center over the years. Including donating his considerable time to curate this exhibition. He has also done a previous exhibition for us that was a traveling exhibition for the town of Brunswick on the 300th anniversary of the Brunswick Town Commons in 2019. He has done previous programs such as this one for us, slideshows like this. He has also written wonderful weekly briefs about the region's history in 2020. When everything was shut down, we were still trying to get the word out about the bicentennial and the history of this region. And he wrote a number of wonderful pieces that we put on Facebook and that the town posted on its website. The way we're going to do this is Jim's got a wonderful, fun slideshow to share with you that expands on what's in the exhibition. He has a lot of images in the slideshow that aren't in the exhibition, and there's things in the exhibition that aren't in the slideshow. So they are truly a compliment. At the end of the slideshow, we're going to welcome folks to unmute and share memories. Certainly ask questions, make comments, but also if you have memories, or you can share information about aviation in this region over the past century. We welcome that. Originally, we were going to try to do a roundtable in person back when this was first conceived, and that didn't happen, but we have a wonderful number of folks on with us today. And I'm sure some of you, I know at least a couple of you are on here who have some great things to share. I would be remiss if I didn't also thank the Town of Brunswick's Davis Fund for supporting this exhibition. That really helped with a lot of the printing and supplies and so forth for the exhibition, and we're very, very grateful to them. And finally, I did note that we have a number of people who registered for this, many of whom are not current members of Pejepscot History Center, and I really welcome you and invite you to check out the many benefits of being a member at PHC. In the link that you got this morning in the email, I did include a link to our membership page as well as our annual fund page. We're quite close to reaching our goal for the year, and we just have a few $1,000s left to meet that goal, and would be very, very grateful for anything you can help us with there. This program is being presented at no cost to you today, and so we really appreciate everybody's support. With that said, I will formally introduce Jym St. Pierre, who will then take it over and do his presentation. Jim has a BA in liberal arts and an MPS degree in natural resources from the University of Maine. And for the past 45 years has held a number of leadership positions in state agencies and nonprofit conservation organizations in Maine. Since 2009, he's been editor of the Maine Environmental News website where he's posted summaries and links to more than 70,000 articles, events, and announcements. I already mentioned the many things he's done for PHC, but he's done a number of things, presentations and writings and so forth for other organizations in our area. And he has served in on a number of boards and other positions for quite a few organizations, including the Brunswick Town Commons Committee, Maine Conservation Voters, the Kennebec Land Trust, the Natural Resources Council of Maine, the Nature Conservancy, Maine chapter, Friends of Baxter State Park, and the Brunswick Topsom Land Trust. So he's somebody who's very engaged in the community and in the history of the community. And we really are very grateful for that. I'll turn it over to you, Jim, and you can unmute yourself. So Jim, we can't hear you.
How's that?
That's great.
Had to use the mouse. Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. First thing I wanted to acknowledge is that today we're talking about the Brunswick area, the traditional homeland of the Wabanaki people. And second, on this Veterans Day, we recognize the service of all past and current members of our defense services. My dad was a veteran who was on Utah Beach in France on D-Day. But the focus of my talk today is about air and space travel in our area. The Brunswick Topsom Harpswell region in Maine has an extraordinary aviation history. In 1903, only 18 years after the Wright brothers made the first successful flight in a heavier than air aircraft, the first airplane landed in Brunswick. The first municipal airport in Maine opened in Brunswick less than a year later. It moved to the Brunswick Town Commons in the 1930s, and then during World War II and the Cold War, it became a military base of national significance for more than half a century. Famous people have flown here. Many more who were not celebrities, but who have made a difference have been here. The leap in technology ushered in by human flight was nothing short of miraculous, as monumental for the world as the modern digital revolution. For the Brunswick region, the revolution in air travel changed the environment, the economy, the population, and connections with the outside world. In the 21st century, Brunswick continues to provide global leadership in air and space travel. And I have to see if I can share. Okay. Let's back up a little bit. For generations, people dreamed of flying like birds. The ancient Chinese invented kites that could carry a person. Leonardo da Vinci produced numerous studies of flight, including in 1505, a codex on the flight of birds, as well as plans for a helicopter, hang glider, parachute, and other flying machines. But few of his ideas were tested in his lifetime. In the 1700s and 1800s, hot air balloons and gliders were built that successfully lifted humans aloft. Of course, at the turn of the 20th century, after 4 years of testing kite and glider designs, Orville and Wilbur Wright of Ohio achieved the first sustained controlled flight in a powered, heavier than air piloted aircraft on December 17, 1903. They made improvements and in 1908 won a contract with the US Army for a flying machine. In the 19-teens, the Wrights operated both a company manufacturing planes and a flying school. Flying was dangerous and there were many failures, including fatal crashes, but planes were quickly adapted for military purposes. They were used for both reconnaissance and bombing, as well as air-to-air combat dogfights in Europe. During World War I, tens of thousands of American soldiers were trained as combat pilots. In 1919, pioneer Maine aviator Harry Jones popularized flying by giving rides to summer visitors from his base at Old Orchard Beach. Later in the 1930s, he planned 21 Maine airports, some of which are still used today. That same year, 1919, movie stuntman Leslie Irvin completed the world's first premeditated parachute jump from an airplane. According to historic data, the weather in Portland on August 19, 1921 was warm and fair. The high temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit, down from 72 the day before. The wind was calm. It was probably about the same in Brunswick. On that Friday, a U.S. Army Air Corps biplane, flown by Lieutenant R.C. Moffett and his mechanic, Sergeant George E. Schmidt, circled overhead. On the golf course links on the River Road, northwest of downtown Brunswick, they spotted a large white circle. They recognized that as the signal for a place to land. They put their plane down on the rough golf course fairway and bounced to a stop. There was no big crowd to greet those pioneer pilots, but the first plane ever to land in Brunswick had arrived. And with it, a whole new era for Brunswick, Topsom, and the rest of the Mid-Coast region. Barely 7 months later, on March 6, 1922, Brunswick voted to appropriate the significant sum of $150 to develop the first municipal, quote, landing station for airplanes, unquote, in the state of Maine. The future of the region had taken wing. Remarkably, we have an aerial photo from a century ago showing the landing field. And I have recreated that on a current Google Earth image. In the early 20th century, aviation progressed at a dizzying pace. New records were set constantly. A year before Moffat's visit, Laura Bromwell broke the record by completing 87 loops in 1920. Aviation was moving ahead so rapidly that just a few weeks before Lieutenant Moffat's plane landed in Brunswick, the US Secretary of War had to prohibit stunt flying over towns for public safety and to stop frightening farm animals. Just 3 days before Moffat's landing here in August 1921, a plane set a world altitude record for hydroplanes, or what we would call a seaplane or float plane today, by carrying 4 people to 19,500 feet over Long Island, New York. And just 6 weeks later, an Army pilot flew a biplane to 37,800 feet above sea level. It's more than 7 miles up. Just 5 days after Moffat's landing here, a bill was introduced in Congress to create a Bureau of Civil Aviation. And the next day, August 25th, 1921, the American Bar Association recommended federal legislation to get this airplane craze under control. And just 2 days after the first flight, just 2 days later, the first in-flight movie was shown on a flight to Chicago. So 10 months after the first landing in Brunswick, on June 12, 1922, 3 aircraft again landed here. One biplane was once again piloted by Lieutenant R.C. Moffett, who just the day before had won a trophy in an air race from Hartford, Connecticut to Springfield, Massachusetts. Another aircraft was U.S. Mailplane 290. This time there was a big celebration. Following a grand luncheon with many speeches at a downtown hotel, the pilots, the local dignitaries, and local onlookers went up River Road. At 4:30 in the afternoon, a dedication was held at the new airfield, which was officially opened as a, quote, landing place for Army and all other birdmen, unquote. Indeed, birdmen and women began alighting here. On September 28, 1923, U.S. Army planes again landed in Brunswick at the crude municipal airport. A year later, there was another big event in Brunswick during those roaring 20s. It wasn't speakeasies, bathtub gin, or flappers. It wasn't even on land. In April 1924, 8 U.S. Army service pilots and mechanics in 4 planes had left Washington State, flying west on the first circumnavigation of the globe by air. The flyers survived, but one aircraft crashed in Alaska. The remaining 3 planes continued and first touched down in the United States again 5 months after their start on Friday, September 5th, 1924, when their hydro aeroplanes made an unplanned landing at Mere Point in Brunswick. They were flying from Nova Scotia and were supposed to land in Boston, where 40,000 well-wishers were waiting for them, but dense fog forced their landing in Maine. Searching for a protected landing place, they flew to Yarmouth, but returned to Mere Point at what one news account described as, quote, one of the prettiest places along the Atlantic seaboard. Another newspaper reported that, quote, cottagers who were astonished at this sudden but nevertheless pleasant invasion rushed from every direction to see the birdmen. While in Brunswick, the 6 Army birdmen were treated to dinner at New Meadows Inn and put up for the night in the homes of summer residents at Mere Point. The next day, after a delay to get more gasoline from Bath, the Army flyers flew from Brunswick to Boston in perfect weather and completed their 175-day journey on September 28 back in Washington State, after making 74 stops and covering 27,550 miles. A year later, a plaque was dedicated at Mere Point by Maine Governor Ralph Brewster to mark the accomplishment of the Round the World Flyers. At that ceremony, one of the flyers, Lieutenant Lee Wade, said, quote, that while larger crowds turned out to welcome the aviators in some of the cities, they had no warmer welcome than that which they received on their arrival at Mere Point. 50 years after the event, on September 5th, 1974, Pejepscot History Center sponsored a celebration of the historic landing at Mere Point. By the way, after he was Maine governor in the late 1920s, Ralph Brewster was a US senator in the 1940s. He had his own aviation scandal. In 1947, he got into a political spat with Howard Hughes, the wealthiest person in America. Hughes accused Brewster of corruption by getting 3 flights from Pan Am while pushing legislation that hurt Hughes' airline. Brewster lost the fight and lost his Senate seat. Hughes lost his mind and became a recluse. He died in 1976, but was resurrected for the 2004 film, The Aviator. Well, the excitement of aviation events in Brunswick during the 1920s wasn't over.
A microphone?
Mute it.
Oh,
Right
Yeah,
here.
okay.
Construction of the Carleton Bridge across the Kennebec River at Bath was a major feat of engineering. In 1928, from June 30th to July 4th, thousands of people attended an historical pageant held there. A fleet of 8 Army planes bringing dignitaries from Boston to the dedication ceremony landed on the athletic field at Bowdoin College in Brunswick. After the First World War ended, some of the demobilized pilots were not ready to give up flying. Air shows became popular with pilots and others performing feats of aerial daring do. There's no record I found of barnstorming events in Brunswick, but events at Old Orchard Beach and Augusta in the 1920s and 30s attracted big crowds. and an airstrip in South Portland started seeing a lot of activity thanks to the flying obsession of a local dentist. Across the country during that golden age of flight, advances in plane construction were being made at a dizzying pace. Plane manufacturers, like car makers, were sprouting up. Learning to fly for many men and women became all the rage. Flying records were being broken routinely, sometimes weekly. However, Brunswick's early hopes faded when the airstrip on River Road didn't attract much use. A second chance at taking wing occurred as the new decade dawned. On March 3rd, 1930, Brunswick voted to establish a committee authorized to lease a portion of the town commons for a new municipal airport. The first regular commercial airline service in Maine started on August 1, 1931. The route between Boston and Halifax, Nova Scotia, included Portland, Rockland, Bangor, and Calais. Brunswick apparently didn't want to be left out. So the focus shifted from the golf course on River Road to the town commons on Bath Road. At first, there was little action. The Great Depression grounded a lot of great expectations. It was another 3 years before a lease was given to Lyndon Mackin and George Stetson in December 1933 for the new municipal airport. But the economy was still in a tailspin. A year later, the lease was terminated. Development of a crewed runway did get done, and the first aircraft landed at the New Brunswick Municipal Airport in June 1934. But the economy remained largely stalled. In the early 1930s, the Roosevelt administration's New Deal was investing heavily in infrastructure, but another airport in Maine was not a priority. That didn't mean there was no excitement. On March 2nd, 1933, the movie King Kong was released. The climactic scene of biplanes shooting the Big Ape off the Empire State Building demonstrated the superiority of air power in case political developments in Europe got worse, which they did. By the way, there have been 11 more King Kong films since that first one, at least 3 TV series, and nearly a dozen video games. The giant ape remains one of the biggest celebrities of the last century, but that's a story for another time. In 1932, development of an airport on the Brunswick Town Commons was still mostly a dream, but birdmen like Charles Lindbergh were breaking records and setting imaginations alight. In May 1927, he had completed the first solo flight across the Atlantic Ocean, which made him one of the most famous people in the world. On Tuesday, September 27th, 1932, Charles Lindbergh urgently needed a place to land. He and his wife, Anne Morrow Lindbergh, were returning from Anne's family home on North Haven Island in Pejepscot Bay when he realized strong headwinds would exhaust their fuel supply. So Lindbergh put his plane down in a pasture at the Powers family farm on Bath Road in Brunswick. The Powers airstrip didn't appear on federal charts until 5 years later, but Lucky Lindy realized it was his best bet. We don't have a photo of Lindbergh in Brunswick, but this one shows when he landed at Old Orchard Beach around that same time. On that day, in September 1932, Lindbergh had more immediate concerns. He needed fuel for his plane. When he landed at Powers Field, Lindy was flying back from North Haven, where he and his wife had sought refuge from the relentless media attention. So here's a little mystery. An article in the Lauriston Journal, September 28, 1932 says, quote, Colonel Charles Lindbergh and his wife, the former Anne Morrow, paid a surprise visit to the Simpson Powers Airport on the Bath Road Tuesday afternoon. Colonel and Mrs. Lindbergh remained at the Powers home for about an hour before continuing their trip to New York from their summer home at North Haven. That seems definitive. However, according to Dorothy Herman's biography of Anne Morrow Lindbergh, Anne gave birth to John, their second son, on August 16th, 1923, less than 6 weeks before the landing in Brunswick. The book says that the kidnapping and death of their son on March 1st, 1932, Anne did not fly again until late March 1933, a year later. If true, she could not have landed in Brunswick in September 1932, half a year later. My best guess is that Anne was with Charles that September day in Brunswick because they were returning from her family's summer home on Pejepscot Bay, but that she had temporarily stopped flying with Charles on his extensive business flights, scouting routes for commercial airlines. In any case, it seems indisputable that Charles Lindbergh landed in Brunswick then. Frank Simpson, who lived across the road from the Powers farm, was himself an aviation pioneer. According to local accounts, when he landed, Lindbergh exited his plane and greeted Frank Simpson by name. They had met in New York when Frank was training for his pilot's license. Frank Simpson went on to an illustrious aviation career, delivering airmail, serving as a flight instructor at Bowdoin College, and test piloting P-47 Thunderbolt fighter planes for Republic Aviation during World War II. But his greatest local fame came later from operating Simpson's Animal Farm, which he ran as a local attraction in Brunswick from 1958 until his death in 1975. On July 31st, 1934, Charles Lindbergh again landed in Brunswick, this time in a pasture on the west side of town. David Douglas had carved out a landing field on his farm, which was located between Durham Road and Old Route 1. Douglas owned several planes, and the airfield was later marked on FAA charts in the 1940s. When he was forced down by fog, Lindbergh was headed to New Jersey from North Haven again. He left his single-engine plane in Brunswick and borrowed a car from the Simpson sisters. Farmer Douglas put a barbed wire fence around Lindbergh's plane to keep his cattle away from it so it could be retrieved. We don't have a picture of Lindbergh in Brunswick, but this photo from the Pejepscot History Center archive shows another plane at Douglas Farm. According to the Lewiston Journal newspaper, quote, a tri-motored passenger plane landed at the field the same day as Lindbergh. At that time, Ford Tri-Motor was the largest civilian aircraft produced in the United States. Lindbergh did pilot one of the Ford Tri-Motor planes, though not this one on that July day in 1934 when he dropped out of the sky onto Douglas Field in Brunswick. The airstrip at the Douglas farm on Durham Road was active for decades. In the 1920s and 30s, it was the site of barnstormers and charter planes. Frank Simpson gave flying lessons there. During World War II, when the Navy developed a naval air base on the town commons, Douglas became Brunswick's only civilian airfield. After the war, it was the location of a GI-approved flying school and the Brunswick Flying Service. But construction of the interstate highway in the 1950s ended all that. It severed the Douglas property, and the Durham Road overpass interfered with the glide pattern, rendering the runway useless. David Douglas sued. He was awarded about $11,000, but he appealed, claiming damages of $50,000. I don't think he was ever awarded that compensation. It took me weeks to figure out the precise location of the Douglas landing field. You can see in this 1998 aerial photo, and even in this 2021 image, you can see the remnants of the landing field still. Now much of it is being developed as a residential subdivision. Another of the most famous early pilots was Amelia Earhart. Among her many aviation accomplishments was the first solo flight by a woman across the Atlantic in May 1932. In 1933-34, to promote commercial flying through her Boston, Maine Airways, Earhart visited Augusta, Waterville, and Bangor. But here's another mystery. Lifelong Brunswick resident Bob Morrill, passed in 2019, often told of how in 1934, when he was 8 years old and his brother Dick was 6, they got to fly for the first time when Amelia Earhart was giving flights in her tri-motor plane at the New Brunswick airport. I've been unable to find any documentation that Earhart was here, but it's wonderful to think maybe she was. Bob Morrill himself went on to train as an Army Air Corps pilot. Boston, Maine Airways changed to Northeast Airlines in 1940 and merged into Delta Airlines in 1972. Amelia Earhart was tragically killed while attempting to circumnavigate the globe in 1937. The top photo here shows Amelia Earhart at the airport in Scarborough in 1933. And the bottom photo shows how she could draw a crowd, as here in Boston. So by the late 1930s, everything was about to change dramatically. In the late 30s, Bowdoin College started a free flight training curriculum in conjunction with the federal government's civilian pilot training program. A number of guys applied. In 1939, the college had room for 12 students. A young woman named Ann Wood applied also for admission. Bowdoin was still an all male then and rejected her application. But when there was one opening left, they hesitantly let her in. Ann Wood earned her pilot's license, became a flight instructor, and was recruited to help the Allied war effort in World War II by joining the British Air Transport Auxiliary. She became one of 24 American women in that program, logging hundreds of flights in 75 different types of military aircraft from 1942 through 1945. After the war, Ann Wood became an attaché at the US Embassy in London, and she held management positions at several airlines, including the first woman vice president at Pan Am. In 1939, Nazi Germany under Hitler launched an assault to conquer surrounding countries. The United States was not officially in the war, but wanted to support the British. In 1941, Bowdoin College leased 48 acres. It had been granted out of the town commons 130 years earlier back to the town, quote, for the purpose of constructing and maintaining an airport. That lease was for 7 months, 22 days, and then the land was to be granted. Meanwhile, on the other side of the globe, Juan Trippe, the founder of Pan American Airways, was implementing an ambitious plan to create commercial air service across the Pacific Ocean to Asia. With the support of the federal government, Pan Am established refueling air bases at several small islands for its flying boats. Japan saw that as an intrusion to its expansion plans. At 7:55 a.m. on December 7, 1941, a date that still lives in infamy, to stop the United States from extending its sphere of influence, 183 planes of the Imperial Japanese Navy bombed the US military base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. An hour and a half later, the second wave of 170 aircraft attacked. 18 US ships were sunk, 188 planes were destroyed, and more than 2,400 American servicemen and women were killed. That same day, Japan also attacked Pan Am airports across the Pacific at Wake Island, Midway Atoll, and Guam. The next day, Congress declared a state of war with Japan, and then 4 days later with Germany. Within 4 months, the war reached Brunswick big time. By April 3rd, 1942, there was an agreement between the town of Brunswick and the US government, quote, regarding operation and maintenance of Brunswick Municipal Airport. 12 days after that, on April 15th, 1943, Naval Airfield Brunswick was established at the town's municipal airport to train Royal Canadian Air Force pilots of the British Naval Command. Ultimately, more than 25 British squadrons were trained here from 1943 to 1945, as well as thousands of Americans. To enlarge the airbase on the town commons, private properties were also taken. Town records show that numerous legal complaints were filed for compensation. On March 13th, 1944, the town voted to accept $10,354.30 in compensation for the taking of 470.6 acres by the US government. Of that, $1,330 was paid to Bowdoin College for 60 acres that had been transferred by the college to the town in 1942 for the Naval Air Base. It was not enough, the court agreed, and on April 24th, 1944, the US government was ordered to pay the town $17,000 for land taken for the base. During the 3 years Naval Airfield in Brunswick was active, more than 3,000 pilots were trained to fly, and thousands of ground crew members also learned their skills here. The base was decommissioned after World War II on December 15th, 1946. However, it was reactivated on March 15th, 1951, and was redesignated as a Naval Air Station 6 months later on September 15th, 1951. During the Cold War, Naval Air Station Brunswick served as a base for Russian submarine hunters. In the 1950s and early 60s, long-range Lockheed P-2 Neptunes, which had 2 propeller-driven engines and 2 jet engines, were used. Starting in the mid-1960s, Lockheed P-3 Orions, which had 4 turboprop engines, took over. They patrolled the North Atlantic and Mediterranean for unfriendly submarines, regularly deploying to far-flung locales such as Sicily, Spain, Bermuda, Iceland, and the Azores. Corsairs, Neptunes, and Orions weren't the only military aircraft at Brunswick. During World War II, dirigibles were used to track German submarines off the Atlantic coast. Brunswick was not one of the 5 East Coast bases for the lighter-than-air ships, but blimps did visit here. And Naval Air Station Brunswick was more than Brunswick. In 1957, the Topsom Air Force Station opened as part of the Bangor Air Defense Sector. Radar installations throughout northern New England fed data into the most sophisticated computers of the day in Topsom to sort and display all tracked aircraft. SAGE stood for Semi-Automatic Ground Environment. After the Air Force closed the Topsom Stage Station in 1969, it functioned as a general support facility for Naval Air Station Brunswick. So after World War II, several private land-based and float-plane landing sites were developed in Brunswick and Topsom, including Riverside and New Meadows in Brunswick, Topsom Airfield and Bradley Field in Topsom, and Maine Coast Seaplane Service on the Androscoggin River. In 1947, the Brunswick Flying Service took over the municipal airport. There was a flurry of commercial activity, and the private sector offered flying lessons and air transport of everything from people to seafood. In the early 60s, the Chamber of Commerce pushed to share the use of the Naval Air Station runways, but the Navy said, quote, it couldn't give landing permission to smaller, unscheduled private and business planes, unquote. A study then recommended development of an airport in the McCoy Pleasant Hill area to meet the quote, growing demands of industry and tourists in Brunswick. However, that failed to get off the ground. So speaking of flying seafood, after the war, the demand for fresh seafood for Maine expanded greatly. To ship live lobsters, Maine Seafood Airlines was formed. These barrels in this picture here probably held dozens of lobsters. But it wasn't just civilians who wanted their lobsters flown in. One Navy veteran recently wrote about a so-called training flight from Virginia to Brunswick in 1958, where the sub-hunter crew picked up a couple hundred young lobsters. On the return flight, they encountered heavy turbulence and were ordered by New York air traffic controllers to circle the east end of Long Island for 40 minutes. When the rough weather upended one of the crates, 25 lobsters escaped. Half of them slipped into a camera hatch that had been left open. The crew was afraid they would be blamed for lobsters raining down on the residents of Long Island from 8,000 feet. But they got away with it, landed safely in Virginia, and divided up the rest of the lobsters with their squadron. It wasn't the last run to Brunswick by Navy guys who were supposed to be searching for Russian submarines and not a lobster feast. Not all the aviation exploits in our area were fun and games. Inevitably, there were accidents, some fatal. I've scoured the records and compiled a list of nearly 4 dozen incidents involving military or civilian aircraft associated with Brunswick area since 1943. Some of the accidents here were involving planes based in Brunswick. A few were planes lost in combat elsewhere. More than 150 flyers lost their lives. Others were injured or walked away with only their dignity hurt. You can see a few pictures here of some of the accidents. So after 6 decades, Naval Air Station Brunswick was disestablished on May 31st, 2011, when Brunswick Executive Airport and Brunswick Landing opened. The Brunswick Naval Air Museum is dedicated to the history of Naval Air Station Brunswick. In 2015, the Brunswick Rotary Club designated the base as a local historic site. Naval Air Station Brunswick had an enormous impact on Brunswick and the Mid-Coast region. Thousands of Navy personnel were stationed here over the more than 60 years it was active. Thousands of family members were part of the community. In the decades since the base closed, scores of former Navy flyers and crew members have attended reunions here, most recently just 2 months ago. Air shows, of course, have also come to Brunswick. The most popular attraction seems to be the Blue Angels, a flight exhibition team that since 1946 has been performing precision demonstrations. It's estimated that the Great State of Maine Air Show this September attracted 20,000 guests from 39 states who generated an economic impact of more than $15 million for the region. Conversion of the former base to non-military uses has been held up as a national success story under the leadership of Steve Levesque and his team at the Mid-Coast Regional Redevelopment Authority. 2,500 jobs have been created by 150 business and academic entities. $750 million have been invested in redevelopment. Nearly 1 million square feet are now occupied. 95,000 square feet are being used by innovation businesses at the Tech Place Incubator. Brunswick Executive Airport is averaging about 20,000 flight operations a year. More than 760 housing units have become available. $4 million a year in property taxes are paid to the towns, and over 1,000 acres have been transferred to the town of Brunswick. The history of aviation in the Brunswick area, I think, is fascinating It's also full of personal stories. I mentioned R.C. Moffat and Charles Lindbergh and Amelia Earhart and Frank Simpson. There's also Ruth Law, who in 1913 dazzled residents, including no doubt some from Brunswick, by piloting a modified biplane over Bath. She went on to set loop-the-loop and cross-country distance flying records. And there's Sumner Sewell of Bath, a World War I flying ace who became Maine governor and was awarded an honorary doctorate degree by Bowdoin College in Brunswick. And there's Robert Rushworth, a native of Madison, Maine. After World War II, he spent his first year at the University of Maine campus here in Brunswick at the Naval Air Station before it was reactivated during the Cold War. In the 1960s, as a test pilot, Rushworth flew the X-15, a hypersonic rocket-powered aircraft, 3,710 miles per hour to an altitude of 54 miles, qualifying as a U.S. wing astronaut. And there's John Young, who was a Navy pilot, set more than 20 records. In 1962, he set a record by reaching a height of 9,843 feet in 34 and a half seconds, flying from Naval Air Station in Brunswick. And there have been many prominent visitors, of course, including at least 2 US presidents, John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And just last year, the presidential plane was in Brunswick again when the National Security Advisor landed here. You can read more about some of these stories at the exhibit at the Pejepscot History Center. So the story of aviation in our area is not just about the past or the air above. It's also about the future and beyond the sky we glimpse. The list of entities active here shows that you can pilot an antique plane, learn to fly drones, take off in a remote-controlled miniature aircraft, and look to the stars. One of the most interesting new developments is Blue Shift Aerospace. Earlier this year in January, the Brunswick-based startup launched the world's first rocket powered by a bio-derived fuel. The company has now raised $1 million to finance its plans to launch a low Earth orbit rocket from Maine, which can carry nanosatellites into space for customers. So the Brunswick Topsom area has played an outsized role in aviation, from the first airplane landing in 1921 to hosting a rocket company in 2021. With a little imagination, you can relive the history of a century of flight by taking a self-directed driving tour of the area. The handouts are available at the Pejepscot History Center. There's a lot happening around the world in flight these days. Billionaires have been racing each other into space. Jetson-like flying cars that actually do fly are being tested. A human-powered plane has been developed in Japan. A hypersonic plane that could travel 5.5 times the speed of sound, or New York to London in under an hour, is being tested. Russians are making the first movie in space. I think maybe it'll be called 2021, The Space Oddity. And last month, the new US Space Force took command of the Prospect Harbor Naval Satellite Operations Center on the Maine coast. There are even rumors that Larissa, the executive director at the Pejepscot History Center, is getting in on the act. Sorry, Larissa, I had to have a little fun there. So I don't know if everything happening is a good idea, but it's an amazing time for air and space travel. Recently, I saw 3 paragliders over Topsom. Then I watched a biplane take off from Brunswick Airport. Richard Branson's Virgin Galactic completed the first space tourism flight. Jeff Bezos went briefly into space in his Blue Origin rocket, which has less environmental impact, he says. Elon Musk's SpaceX is shuttling astronauts to the International Space Station. He's also planning astrotourism flights and is building future Moon and Mars space stations for NASA. As for me, for now, I'm staying on the ground. Thanks for listening.
Jim, that was so wonderful. As always, we can always expect not only great scholarship, research, illustrations, but a great and dry sense of humor. I'm pretty sure that's the first time I've ever been in any sort of space garb. Thank you so much for doing that. I really appreciate it. We will take a few minutes here. It is about 10 minutes to 1, and we would love to take a few minutes. Jim, if you want to stop sharing your screen so we can kind of see folks, and we can see hands raised. If you want to raise your hand, put a question in the chat box or a comment. But we would love to hear from some folks if you have memories of aviation in our region, or want to ask a question or make a comment. And I'm seeing some nice thank you. Thank you, Jim. What an interesting presentation. Some nice comments there. If you are interested in sharing anything, if you can turn on your video and and turn off your mute, you're welcome to do that. I did note somebody just mentioned your great puns, and this is Tim who's turned on his video. He just mentioned Jim's great puns, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because Jim is a true king of metaphor, and I feel like we should have run a quiz or something. We could have given a prize away for the person who caught the most aviation metaphors in Jim's presentation. Tim, did you want to say something?
Mainly just thank you to Jim. Great presentation. I was sucked right into wanting to watch today because the publicity material talked about Ann Wood. And I actually knew Ann Wood. I knew her as Ann Wood Kelly, grew up with her in Massachusetts, where I was from, Manchester, Massachusetts, where she was still a pilot, still very active, and flew with my dad, who was another pilot from World War II. So it was just in the small world category. Those little intersections are always fun. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
How neat. That's awesome. Somebody else? I see some, Pinky, did you want to, you've unmuted. Did you want to say something?
I did. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I used to live in South Florida and went to a presentation one time by a local person down there. And there used to be a base on which is now the property of Florida Atlantic University. And he told us that Russians actually used to come ashore around the Boca Raton area there under cover of night, and they would actually mingle in with the local people and go shopping and things like that. And I was wondering if that ever happened here in Maine.
You want me to answer that?
Yeah.
Can you?
I think there's at least one well-documented time when Russian agents landed by submarine on the Maine coast, not by airplane. I did recently rewatch the old movie, The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming.
Which is not true.
which is not Maine, it's Massachusetts, I think, but it's close. Other than that, I don't know of any Russians during the Cold War who arrived to do any shopping here. So
Yeah, he said they did come in shore by boats, probably like an oar-driven boat or something from the submarines. It was not from the airfield.
maybe
We
they just wanted lobsters,
Maybe.
We actually have somebody who recently donated some items from a Russian ship that I can't even tell you where exactly it docked, but locally. This man and his wife actually went around to Goodwill and bought up all the denim, the jeans to give to the Russians, because that was quite coveted, Levi's and so forth. And so we now have a picture of Gorbachev that was in one of those ships with his thank you very much. What is his birth defect, his mark on his head airbrushed out, I guess. But we have that, and as well as some pictures of the ship. So apparently they were here. Anybody else like to share anything or ask a question? Yes, Tim.
Jim, did you ever see the book I had bought? Actually, I bought it on eBay, and it was the building of the Naval Air Station during World War II. It was a secret document. I actually donated the original to the museum on the base, but I did keep a copy I made a copy for myself. Did you ever see that document? It's a book. It has a lot of cool pictures and the stories of the base and of the surrounding bases that they had built for emergency landings that you had mentioned today. It's a really cool, I got to show it to you. I thought you had seen it over there. And of course, because of your reference to me going over to the Naval Air Station and connecting with Bob Leclerc, I had made a lot of copies of the maps of the different phases of the growth of the base, which was really cool because it shows all three the growth phases. And I was trying to find my great grandfather's property because I heard that he had owned a lot of blueberry land out there, but I found the names of all the property owners of the three major phases of growth, which is really cool. There's a lot of information that I would someday I'd like to put it into some type of records, but I don't know if you've seen that book, but sometimes we got to get together. I got to show it to you. And of course, the neatest map that I made a copy of, and it's the only one that I made a display for the museum over there, but we went there this weekend and we didn't see it at all, except for the one map that shows the major expansion in the 50s when the 12 families that had moved from the southern end of the base. It shows the old airport superimposed with a new airport. You've probably seen that one, I'm sure. It's probably about 30 by 30 in size.
Have you seen that, Jim?
I've seen, I'm not sure about book. I've seen some of the plans, and the Brunswick Naval Air Museum has a lot of those, has copies of a lot of those plans that show how the base.
I actually made them a display there.
Yeah,
but
that's a whole. I didn't have time in this presentation to get into the details of that, but that's a whole nother story. And maybe Pejepscot History Center, we could receive some of that information because it's really significant local history.
Yeah, that would be
How
great.
the base changed and some of the private properties. There's some very interesting stories Fred Korber has talked about in Marikina area. Some of the private landowners lost their properties when the base expanded, and the human side of those stories would be interesting to document.
Right.
Sorry, I just need to step in just for a second. I apologize. It is 1 o'clock, and I wanted to just check and see if Millie Stewart was still on with us. And I see her name on here, but I don't know if she is still listening, because she is the niece of Frank Simpson, who was mentioned in the slideshow, and we were hoping to have her share a couple things about Frank. but I'm not seeing her unmute. So I think maybe we don't still really have her with us. So I think what we're going to have to do, because it is one, is I don't see any other comments in the chat box either, is wrap it up. And thank you again, Jim, very, very much. We really appreciate your time today and all the work that you put into the exhibit and to this presentation. And thank you to everybody who attended today.
Thank you.
And we will say goodbye. Have a great weekend and happy Veterans Day. Take care.